And amid reports of Hamas gunfire near the town of Tulkarm, Israel's far-right finance minister Smotrich issued this threat. If the terror continues, we'll turn Tulkarm into ruins like in the Gaza Strip. In a moment, we'll get a first-hand account from a British surgeon just back from Gaza. But first, correspondent Jeremy Diamond has the latest on the controversial military operation in Rafah.
On a hilltop in western Rafah, Israeli tanks overlook Gaza's border with Egypt, the Israeli military's latest prize. 3 weeks into its Rafah offensive, Israel says it now controls the strategic Philadelphia corridor, spanning the length of that 7.5-mile-long border, which the Israeli military says Hamas has used to smuggle weapons into Gaza. Egypt denies these tunnels exist.
The Philadelphia corridor served as Hamas's oxygen pipeline, through which Hamas regularly smuggled weapons into the Gaza Strip. So far, our forces have located about 20 tunnels in the Philadelphia corridor area. We investigate these tunnels and neutralize them.
This is the human toll of that military offensive. The United Nations says more than 940,000 people have been forced to flee the city in recent weeks. For many, this is not the first time. There is no safety. Al-Mawasi is hit, the UN warehouses are hit, the UN schools are hit. There is no safety. Taysir Al-Jaz says, you might die at any moment, anywhere. Multiple Israeli strikes on camps for displaced Palestinians in recent days have made that point with deadly clarity. None more so than this strike in northwestern Rafah on Sunday night, which killed at least 45 people and injured hundreds more, according to Gaza's Ministry of Health. The Israeli military has said it did not expect civilians to die and has launched an investigation into the strike, which killed 2 senior Hamas militants. But at least 3 people can be seen on the road outside those structures moments before the strike. The Israeli military targeted these 2 container-like structures, just steps away from structures housing displaced civilians, which were also destroyed in the blast or the subsequent fire. 4 weapons experts tell CNN the weapons used in the strike were U.S.-made bombs. They say these remnants found at the site of the attack are pieces of a GBU-39 small-diameter bomb, carrying a relatively small payload intended to minimize civilian casualties. But dropping them in densely populated areas can still have devastating consequences.
If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah.
But for now, the U.S. doesn't plan to stop providing those weapons, with the White House insisting Israel hasn't crossed that red line.
We don't want to see a major ground operation. We haven't seen that at this point.
Major or not, the Israeli military is now deep in Rafah, where Palestinian rescuers are struggling to safely reach the wounded, as the dangers are mounting for so many.
Jeremy Diamond reporting from Jerusalem. Now, on Wednesday, the Palestine Red Crescent Society said 2 of its medics were killed near Rafah when their ambulance was hit. Israel says it fired on a, quote, suspicious vehicle that was approaching troops, and the incident is under review. British surgeon Dr. Nick Maynard is just back from Gaza, where he saw the collapsing healthcare system with his own eyes. He left Rafah just before Israel's offensive began, and he's joining me here now in the studio. Dr. Maynard, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for asking me.
You left, and I'm just going to read what you said, because you left just as the Israeli incursion began. You told Reuters that you heard bombs and gunfire all over. Driving through Rafah, the tension was palpable, with people evacuating as rapidly as they could. You saw some of that attempt to evacuate in Jeremy's package there. What did you see, and what is the status of people who just want to get out of the way?
So they issued the initial evacuation orders about 2 hours before we left for the crossing, and we saw hundreds of people rushing out of their, I was going to say houses. They're not houses, of course. These people have been displaced many times, so they were leaving their very temporary shelters, their makeshift tents, their tarpaulin shelters, gathering their belongings together, going in cars, some of them walking, some of them going on a cart with donkeys and rushing out. And it was very distressing to see them leaving so urgently, because for some of them, this is the 5th, 6th, 7th time they'd done that in the last 6 months.
Well, you were leaving as well. What was it like for you? Was it, I mean, you're obviously out safely, but was it dangerous as you were trying to get out?
So we didn't think we were going to get out. We were initially turned away, so we went back to the temporary... Well, we were advised to leave. So there was ongoing discussions between the Medical Aid for Palestinian ground staff and COGAT, the liaison part of the IDF. And so they initially decided for security reasons we should go back to the house. But then we left again late morning, got to the crossing as the bombings were intensifying. So we were surrounded by bombs going off really virtually non-stop. And there was very difficult decisions to be made about whether we should carry on with our planned departure or whether we should turn around because it was getting too dangerous. But we did stay and we managed to get out.
You warned in March, actually, before the Rafah operation started, certainly before, you know, that if a ground invasion happened, a ground incursion of some sort, it would be apocalyptic. And Gaza's health ministry said in a statement, now, particularly after the Sunday attack, there is no hospital in Rafah with enough capacity to take this number of killed and injured, causing confusion amongst ambulance teams on where to transfer them. Give us a layout of what hospitals remain, what don't, anywhere nearby these places that are, you know, under IDF attack.
So Rafah is a small town. It has a population of 100,000 to 200,000 people normally. It has 2 hospitals, one government hospital, Al-Najah Hospital, which normally has a capacity of about 60 beds, and a small hospital called the Kuwaiti Hospital, which has been in the news a lot in the last few days, which has a capacity normally of 15 beds. So they have very limited beds there. They've got a bigger hospital between Rafah and Khan Yunis called the European Gaza Hospital, which I've worked in a lot over the years, which is surrounded by the Israeli ground forces. So it's very difficult for patients to get to that. So effectively, there are no hospitals for these patients to go to. There are some field hospitals being set up, but the number of acute beds available to take these patients is very, very few.
And have you been in touch with any colleagues in the medical profession or anybody in Rafah since you've left, particularly in the last few days?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke yesterday to a dear friend of mine who's an operating theatre nurse who almost to the day a year ago I was operating with in the theatres in European Gaza Hospital. She stayed in Rafah. She and her husband are living there. They don't want to leave. And she said to me yesterday she would rather die, and she expects to die in her home, and she's not going to leave. I haven't been able to get hold of her today, and she hasn't answered any message, so I don't know what's happened to her. Half her family have been killed in the last few months. I've got a close friend who's a doctor who's out there, and I've been speaking to them regularly. But the words we used a few weeks ago of this being apocalyptic, it absolutely is. There are many people being killed there. Those that have been evacuated have been forced to go to Al-Mawasi, which is an area I know well. There are already hundreds of thousands of people there. They've had to accommodate nearly 1 million extra people, and there is nothing there. Al-Mawasi is a thin stretch of sand and wasteland divided by a road with no facilities at all. So the idea they can accommodate in any sort of safe way another 1 million people is fanciful.
You're a doctor, you're a surgeon, and you've worked in Gaza for some 10 years. You've been going back and forth through other wars, presumably. I want to ask you this, because you saw in Jeremy Diamond's report there, they saw the weapons, they were described as slightly less huge and powerful, perhaps to try to mitigate civilian damage. These are American-made weapons. But from a doctor's point of view, particularly, as he said, Jeremy, in a densely populated zone, a light bomb or heavy bomb is going to create a huge amount of civilian destruction. What can you say about the weapons that are used?
So Gaza's got a population of 2.2 million. It is the most densely populated place in the world. I was there last May operating on, I'm a cancer surgeon, I was operating on cancer patients as part of the MAP program, and it was the last big bombardment before October the 7th, the beginning of May, and I was stuck there. They closed the borders and we had to be evacuated eventually. but I witnessed for 4 days this non-stop bombardment, and it was an incredible demonstration of how precise the bombing can be when the Israeli Defense Force want to do that. They were targeting specific rooms in buildings, specific floors, and there was collateral damage, but minimal collateral damage at that time. So I've witnessed at first hand how precise their targeting can be. Move forward to post-October the 7th. I was there over Christmas and New Year, and I watched the indiscriminate bombing of large populations in the surrounding camps in Deir al-Balah, where I was staying for 2 weeks. So I've witnessed two extremes. I've seen how precise their targeting can be, and I've seen how indiscriminate it can be. And there's no doubt in my mind that what we've seen since October the 7th is indiscriminate killing of large population civilians.
You know, they deny that every time, and they say over and over again that we are doing our best to minimize civilian. And they say, what do you expect if the Hamas terrorist organization, as they say they're fighting, is using human shields, is using Gazans to shield themselves from any kind of retaliation or action? What do you say about that?
Well, I've not witnessed that. I think it's difficult for me to understand how anyone can claim that killing 35 civilians is a proportionate response to events earlier. But
you mean 35,000?
35,000 people. I've not witnessed what they're describing, and perhaps more importantly than that, my friends and colleagues who I have spoken to daily since October the 7th, have lived out there with them for several weeks since then, do not provide any evidence to support that.
They would say that they're there. They live in these, whatever, the underground or in buildings or whatever. That's what they would say. But it's interesting what you said about witnessing very targeted and witnessing something that's much less targeted. I want to ask you specifically in your domain about the health system. I mean, I can just read you and you'll tell me much more. I mean, Kamal Adwan Hospital, dozens of medical staff is taken to an undisclosed location. That was in December last year. The IDF says takes all feasible precautions to mitigate harm, etc. Nasser Hospital, February of this year. 70 healthcare workers in the medical complex arrested by Israeli forces, 80 patients transferred out. They said they had apprehended hundreds of Hamas militants. Al-Shifa Hospital, well, we know what's happened there. It's completely a ruin. They said they were going after Hamas targets underneath and tunnels. Did you ever come across anything suspicious? Did you ever ask any of actually the directors of the hospitals, the people who would be there when you're not there, whether there was any threat from a militant group using their premises?
I did. And I can only really vouch for what I have witnessed and what close friends and colleagues have said. I've been in these hospitals on many occasions, before October the 7th, but also since then. I've never seen any evidence of Hamas militants in these hospitals. And my close friends and colleagues, some of whom I've known for nearly 15 years, I've asked them repeatedly, and they've never witnessed any of this. Now, clearly, I cannot provide any evidence for what goes on in any tunnels underneath. I've never seen them. But if you take Shifa Hospital as an example, which I know very well, I've been to every square inch of that hospital. I have never seen any restricted access at all to any parts of the hospital. So I've seen no evidence of what they describe.
Meantime, what injuries were you seeing? I mean, as you say, you've been there many, many times. You're a cancer surgeon. You're not necessarily, your profession is not to do traumatic surgeries.
No, absolutely.
So what have you been doing since you've been there, and what have you seen?
So when I was there for 2 weeks over Christmas and New Year, we saw a huge amount of trauma, and that was really major blast injuries from bombs affecting the abdomen and the chest with severe shrapnel injuries. So we spent the whole time operating on major chest injuries, major abdominal injuries with the local surgeons. My most recent trip, from which I returned just 3 weeks ago, we saw a different pattern of illnesses. We did see some blast injuries, but the amount of bombings were much less. But what we did see, and what kept us really busy in the operating theatre, were the problems with malnutrition. And we highlighted this when we were there over Christmas and New Year, and it's got much, much worse. We know the IPC has designated northern Gaza as a famine area. The malnutrition in middle Gaza and southern Gaza is now extreme. And we saw the consequences of that. And it's not just that they're losing weight, but they become immunosuppressed if they're malnourished, and they don't heal. So we saw many patients who'd had surgery for war injuries, for blast injuries, for gunshot wounds, whose wounds were falling to pieces, and their internal organ repairs, the bowel repairs, the liver repairs, the pancreas repairs, they were all disintegrating, falling to pieces. And the consequences of that are devastating. And I had patients, I'll talk about two patients in particular, 16-year-old Tala and 18-year-old Lama, both young ladies, both of whom had blast injuries from bombs, both of whom had major surgery to repair, both of whom were severely malnourished before they came, and both of whom died under our care as a direct result of malnutrition. So the effects of malnutrition now are going to cause far, far more excess deaths than we have seen so far.
And how do you live with this? How do you sleep at night?
It's very difficult. I mean, I say to my friends and family that part of my therapy is actually coming to talk about it to people like you, because this is not being reported adequately. We need, those of us that are witness it, need to tell everyone what's going on, need to make sure our governments understand the appalling consequences of the ongoing military assault in Gaza.
Dr. Nick Maynard, thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much for asking me.